Power never announces itself. The moment it feels the need to be explained, it has already begun to decay. True power enters quietly, without urgency, without noise, and without apology. When certain men step into a space, something inside other people reacts before thought has time to form. Posture changes, voices lower, movements slow, attention sharpens. No command is given, yet alignment begins. This is not respect earned through effort, nor fear created through force. It is something older, deeper, and far more automatic. Human beings like to believe submission is a conscious decision, a moral or social choice. It is not. Submission is a biological response. Long before laws existed, before language was refined, before ethics were taught, survival depended on identifying which men were stable under pressure and which were not. The nervous system learned to detect authority not through words, but through emotional signals. That ancient software still runs quietly in the background of every interaction today. Certain men trigger that system without trying. They do not speak quickly. They do not rush to fill silence. They do not explain who they are or what they want. They move as if time bends slightly round them. Their emotional state appears sealed, contained, self-regulated. And the human brain, encountering this containment, assigns rank automatically. Dominance is not aggression. Aggression is often compensation. True dominance is emotional non-reactivity. A man who is not pulled by the environment, not destabilized by approval or rejection, not pressured by outcomes, appears internally complete. And completeness is interpreted by the brain as superiority. Not morally, not intellectually, structurally. Most men leak their inner world constantly. Their tone reveals need. Their speed reveals anxiety. Their explanations reveal insecurity. They over-communicate because they are afraid of being misunderstood. They overreact because they are afraid of losing control. In doing so, they unknowingly signal lower status. The brain reads this instantly. A man who needs to be understood is not a leader. A man who needs approval is not a reference point. Stillness, on the other hand, creates imbalance. When one man remains calm while others are emotionally active, the environment begins to orbit him. Humans are deeply uncomfortable with unresolved tension. Silence without weakness feels heavy. It demands interpretation. And when interpretation is required, authority begins to form. This is where submission truly starts. Not when orders are given, but when people begin to adjust themselves without being asked. They choose words more carefully. They wait for reactions. They look for cues. They feel relief when alignment is achieved. None of this feels like obedience from the inside. It feels like logic. It feels like common sense. It feels earned. That is why it is so powerful that the most dangerous men are not unpredictable and chaotic. They are consistent in their values, but selective in their responses. You never know which version of their attention you will receive: engagement, distance, or silence. This controlled ambiguity forces others to self-regulate. People begin to monitor themselves in his presence. They correct their own behavior. They suppress impulses. They seek resonance. Control becomes unnecessary because alignment is now internal. Predictable men feel safe. Safe men are tolerated. Unreadable men feel powerful. Power does not come from mystery alone, but from mystery combined with stability. When a man appears emotionally solid yet selectively inaccessible, the brain assigns him disproportionate weight. His reactions matter more. His silence feels louder. His approval feels heavier. This is why people often say they do not know why they respect certain men. They mistake the effect for charisma, intelligence, or confidence. In reality, they are responding to emotional containment. A man who does not spill himself into the world forces the world to project meaning onto him. Silence becomes depth. Restraint becomes strength. Distance becomes authority. Submission deepens because the brain prefers order over freedom. Chaos is more terrifying than hierarchy. When a man appears to be a stabilizing force, resistance feels irresponsible. Following him feels rational. Aligning with him feels safe. This is not weakness. It is efficiency. The brain is conserving energy by attaching itself to perceived certainty. No one ever decides to submit. It happens in increments so small they feel invisible. A glance held slightly longer. a pause before speaking, a need for confirmation, a subtle shift in tone. By the time awareness catches up, the hierarchy is already in place. At that point, obedience feels voluntary because it feels natural. The darkest truth is this: people do not submit because they are weak. They submit because they are unfinished. A man who appears internally complete becomes a psychological anchor. Others orient around him not for protection, but for direction. His emotional state becomes a reference. His reactions become feedback. His presence becomes structure. This is why criticism from such men cuts deeper. This is why praise feels disproportionate. This is why distance feels like punishment even when nothing is said. The man has become a silent axis, and others have unknowingly aligned their sense of self around him. Power like this does not require performance. It does not need validation. It does not seek loyalty. It simply exists, and others adapt themselves to remain in proximity to it. The man does not chase relevance. He does not demand obedience. He does not correct every misunderstanding. He allows people to reveal themselves, and in doing so, he gains leverage without effort. Most men will never experience this kind of authority because they are too visible emotionally. They announce their desires. They explain their motives. They rush to be understood. They mistake expression for strength. In reality, power accumulates where emotional leakage is minimal. The men people submit to are rarely the loudest, the most aggressive, or the most expressive. They are the ones who are never hurried by life, never cornered emotionally, never desperate to be chosen. They let the world move around them. And because the human mind is wired to seek orientation, the world instinctively follows. This is not morality. This is not ideology. This is psychology operating beneath awareness. And once you understand that submission is not demanded but triggered, not forced but felt, you realize something unsettling. Power is not taken from people. It is given to those who create the control becomes truly powerful the moment it disappears. The most dominant men in history were never the ones shouting orders or demanding obedience. They were the ones who shaped the environment so completely that obedience felt like the only sensible option. When power is visible, it invites resistance. When power is invisible, it becomes unquestioned. The human mind does not rebel against control itself. It rebels against being controlled. There is a critical difference. When influence is subtle, when direction feels self-chosen, resistance collapses. This is why certain men never need to command. They create frames, and others willingly step inside them. A frame is the psychological context in which decisions are made. Whoever controls the frame controls the outcome. Dominant men rarely argue facts. They define meaning. They decide what matters and what does not. They do this not through persuasion, but through calm certainty. When a man behaves as if something is obvious, the brain of the observer assumes it must be. Questioning it would require energy, confidence, and social risk. Most people do not have enough of any of the three. This is where submission deepens. People stop asking whether they agree. They start asking whether they align. Alignment feels safer than disagreement because disagreement threatens separation from the perceived center of stability. The man who appears emotionally unshakable becomes that center. Emotional withdrawal is one of the most misunderstood tools of dominance. It is not coldness. It is selectivity. Attention from a dominant man is never guaranteed. It is given, removed, and restored without explanation. This unpredictability conditions behavior more effectively than punishment ever could. The brain begins to associate compliance with connection and resistance with distance. Over time, people regulate themselves to avoid losing access. This process happens slowly. Beneath awareness, people tell themselves stories to justify it. They say the man is busy, focused, important, disciplined. They rationalize the imbalance because accepting the truth would mean admitting loss of autonomy. The ego protects itself by reframing submission as choice. Controlled silence amplifies this effect. Silence forces projection. When a man does not immediately respond, others fill the gap with interpretation. They assume disappointment, judgment, or superiority. Even when none exists, the imagined meaning shapes behavior. Silence becomes louder than speech. Most men fear silence because it exposes them. Dominant men use silence because it exposes others. The one who speaks less reveals less leverage. The one who listens more gathers information without giving any away. This asymmetry creates power. Another critical mechanism is outcome independence. A man who appears unaffected by success or failure destabilizes others emotionally. When someone cannot be rewarded or punished easily, they become difficult to control. The brain responds to this by attempting alignment rather than manipulation. People give more, explain more, and adjust more in hopes of influencing a man who seems immune to influence. Predictable reward systems create obedience. Unpredictable reward systems create submission. When approval is rare and inconsistent, it becomes more valuable. This is basic conditioning, but when applied subtly in human relationships, it becomes devastatingly effective. The man does not need to be cruel. He simply needs to be selective. As this dynamic deepens, people begin to mirror the dominant man's behavior. They adopt his language, his pace, his values. This is not admiration. It is synchronization. Humans instinctively synchronize with perceived power to reduce friction. Over time, individuality erodes. The group begins to think, move, and react in alignment with one central figure. At this stage, dissent feels unnatural. Speaking against the frame feels like stepping into chaos. Even when people privately disagree, they remain silent. Silence is rewarded with belonging. Resistance is punished with isolation. No one needs to say this out loud. Everyone feels it. The most unsettling part is that the dominant man does not need to be consciously manipulative. These mechanisms activate automatically when certain behavioral patterns are present. Emotional restraint, selective attention, slow pacing, minimal explanation. Together, they create an atmosphere where submission feels logical. This is why power consolidates so quickly around certain men. Once the environment adapts, it reinforces itself. People who resist are subtly marginalized. People who comply are subtly elevated. The system selects for obedience without overt force. The man simply remains consistent, and the hierarchy solidifies around him. People begin to measure themselves against his reactions. Approval feels like progress. Disinterest feels like failure. The man has not asked for this role, yet it has been assigned to him. He becomes a silent authority, not because he demands it, but because others need it. Most people are not seeking freedom. They are seeking relief from uncertainty. A man who appears certain offers relief. Even if his certainty is an illusion, the emotional effect is real. People surrender autonomy not because they are weak, but because autonomy is exhausting. This is how control becomes self-sustaining. The man does nothing extraordinary. He does not change his tone. He does not increase pressure. He simply remains unmoved, and the more unmoved he remains, the more others move toward him. By the time anyone realizes what has happened, the hierarchy is complete. The man is no longer influencing behavior. He is defining reality. His presence alone sets limits. His absence creates anxiety. His return restores order. This is not leadership in the inspirational sense. It is authority in its raw psychological form, quiet, unseen, effective, and once established, almost impossible. The final stage of submission does not look like obedience. It looks like identity. By the time this stage arrives, people no longer ask why they follow. They no longer weigh alternatives. They no longer experience the tension of choice. The hierarchy has moved from behavior into self-concept. The man is no longer a leader or an influence. He has become a reference point. This is where power becomes permanent. The human mind needs orientation. Without it, anxiety grows. When a man consistently appears emotionally solid, internally regulated, and unmoved by external pressure, others begin to outsource their sense of direction to him. His reactions become signals. His silence becomes feedback. His presence becomes stabilizing. Over time, people stop checking themselves against reality and start checking themselves against him. This is not worship. It is psychological anchoring. People begin to define what is acceptable, intelligent, respectable, or valuable based on how they believe he would respond. Even when he is not present, his perceived judgment fills the space. This is how authority survives distance. The man does not need to monitor behavior. The behavior monitors itself. At this stage, resistance feels like self-betrayal. Disagreeing with the man feels less like challenging an external figure, and more like disrupting one's own internal structure. The cost of dissent is no longer conflict, it is disorientation, and most people will endure almost anything to avoid disorientation. This is why people defend powerful men even when doing so harms them. They are not protecting the man, they are protecting the structure that keeps their inner world stable. Without him, uncertainty floods back in. Without him, choices return. Without him, responsibility feels heavier. The man has become a psychological shelter. What makes this dynamic especially dark is that it often forms without conscious intent. The man does not need to demand loyalty. He does not need to manipulate narratives. He only needs to remain consistent in his emotional containment. The rest happens automatically. Humans are pattern recognition machines. When they detect stability, they attach dot as identity erosion deepens. People begin to narrow themselves. They censor thoughts. They suppress impulses. They edit personality traits that feel misaligned with the man's perceived values. The self-editing feels voluntary. In reality, it is adaptive. The mind is reducing friction by reshaping itself around power over time. People lose awareness of who they were before alignment. They forget which ideas were originally theirs. They forget which desires came from within. They mistake proximity for purpose. Meaning becomes externalized. Motivation becomes conditional. This is why distance from such men feels unbearable. When the anchor disappears, the internal compass spins. Anxiety rises. Confidence drops. People interpret this as longing, loyalty, or respect. In truth, it is withdrawal. The nervous system has grown accustomed to orientation, and now it has lost it. The most revealing sign of this stage is how people react to the man's indifference. Anger would indicate independence. Indifference creates collapse, when approval is no longer sought consciously, but needed subconsciously. Even silence feels like judgment. At this point, the man no longer needs to influence outcomes. Outcomes arrange themselves. People anticipate his preferences and act accordingly. They compete for proximity. They rationalize sacrifices. They justify imbalance. The hierarchy sustains itself through internal pressure rather than external force. This is why true power is so rarely challenged. Challenging it would require people to reconstruct their identity, tolerate uncertainty, and reclaim responsibility. That is a painful process. Most will choose submission over self-redefinition. The man, meanwhile, remains largely unchanged. This is what makes the dynamic asymmetrical. He does not rely on the structure in the same way others do. He could walk away. He could disengage. He could disappear. The others cannot. That imbalance is the final seal of dominance. What appears from the outside as loyalty is, from the inside, dependency. What appears as respect is often orientation. And what appears as choice is usually conditioning completed long ago. This is the ultimate truth people avoid. Power does not enslave the unwilling. It reshapes the willing until they no longer recognize the shape of the cage. By the time submission is visible, it has already been accepted as identity. The men people submit to are not always cruel. Many are quiet, disciplined, even restrained. But restraint itself can become a weapon when it creates emotional scarcity. When access is limited, it gains value. When certainty is rare, it gains authority. When orientation is externalized, identity dissolves. This is why power, once established at this level, rarely needs to assert itself. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not chase compliance. It simply exists as a gravitational center, and others orbit it to avoid drifting into uncertainty. Understanding this does not make you powerful, but it does make you immune. Once you recognize how submission forms, how control becomes invisible, and how identity quietly erodes, you begin to see authority where others only feel it. And the moment power is seen clearly, it loses its ability to